we're back, and we are continuing our show with an update on the biggest issue for us today, which is the situation of the floods. With us on the line, we have the principal hydrologist, Tennille Hendy, and she is going to shed some light for us as to where these waters are going to be moving. Good morning, and thank you for chatting with us this morning.
Hi, good morning, Marlene. Good morning, Belize. Just to give you an update, Marlene,
yes.
The dams are still over the spillway in the west, and we're seeing those floodwaters coming down. We have Rancho Dolores, Limonal, parts of the Belize River Valley already experiencing flooding. And on the Saboon River, we have communities such as Gracie Rock, Hattiesville, 8 Miles, and even coming down into Belize City, already seeing floodwaters. So we're asking that residents remain vigilant and that they move when they can.
Tennille, you know, it has been noted that this is a record-breaking flood for us, and so we don't know the extent as to how much it can affect people. You said from Friday that this water is going to be moving down. Are we going to expect the levels that we saw in San Ignacio all the way down into Belize City?
Marlene, the floodwaters still haven't reached Belize City as yet. Because if you notice, Roaring Creek, San Ignacio, all those areas, Bullet Tree, all in the west are still flooded. So we're expecting those floodwaters to come down. We've started to see some trickling in, but it's still not at the peak stage yet where we can say, okay, this is the worst of the flood and it should level off now. We haven't seen that peak come into the city as yet.
You had given us an approximate timeline when I spoke with you on Friday, right? In terms of it being perhaps 4 to 5 days before we begin to experience those waters in our parts? Right.
We can expect to see those flooding conditions prevail throughout this week.
Now, what does thankfully, since Sunday we've been getting sunshine, how does that impact the forecast for the floods?
Well, you know, it goes through the normal processes of evaporation, but unfortunately, it won't evaporate as much as we would like. So we should see not much change from the floodwaters, the heavy floodwaters that we are expecting, but it will help in reducing the amount of floodwaters coming down. It won't be significant, but it will help nonetheless.
So let's go region by area by area. Has Cayo seen the worst of it so far?
Yes, they have. To a certain extent, let me correct that, to a certain extent, because the dams are still flooding. We did a flyover with Nemo, and we saw that there's still a whole lot of water behind those dams that are still spilling over their spill reservoirs, no? So it might not go all the way up as we expected, but the rivers should stay in flood stage for quite a while.
Okay. And when the water comes down from Guatemala?
I do believe that we're starting to see that now, Marlene, that it's all the runoff now. The rains have stopped, and usually when the rains stop, you don't have that additional precipitation coming in. So now what you're seeing is all the runoff.
Okay. So that's talking about Cayo, where they still must monitor, but it probably won't be as bad as they saw last week. Before we come down to the Belize district or south, let's talk about the north. How are they going to be impacted?
Okay, we've had reports of some villages seeing flood levels, but we are speaking with our hydrological observers who are in that area, and they will be giving us an update so that we can produce the flood forecast for today. So later on today, we should have a more holistic picture of what is happening throughout the country.
But it's quite possible that they will see the rivers possibly flood as well.
It is possible because Mexico was also affected by Hurricane Eta. So, and they were receiving, I believe, almost the same amount of rain that we were getting on those last bands. So we should expect to see some elevated levels in those rivers up north.
Okay. All right. And the south?
The south, from what I've seen on the recon, they are pretty much leveling off. However, it might look like there's no flood waters on the ground, but the rivers tell a different story. And so that's why we have our manual gauges, because at times when it's raining, people expect to see flood levels, but it's not affecting the river as yet. But visually, and reports coming in, we saw that some of the rivers are going down.
Okay, that's good news. And now the area of concern, as you have noted from the end of last week, is when that water makes its way out to the Caribbean Sea through the Belize district. Where should we be paying attention to at this time?
Usually the areas that are flooding, you would notice coming down is true when the Belize River cuts into the Haulover Creek. As well, when the Saboon channels its waters through Burden Canal. Up to yesterday, when I did a visual check, floodwaters were very rapidly coming in from the Saboon River, and some areas were on the highway were actually flooded. Points of interest where you normally see it is by Old Belize, coming down past the police station. All that area on the left side coming down is usually where the water would overflow into before it reaches the road. But there were some parts of the road that were already under some water. So we will expect to continue seeing that flood waters coming into the city.
Any direct threat to the 8 Mile community, as you've mentioned earlier, being behind the Saboon River?
Yes, well, on the Saboon River, the 8 Mile community has been getting reports of some persons sending me pictures that their yards are already flooded, and this is expected because the Saboon River is located on that side where we know as West Lake. So it runs behind that area. So it is expected that once the Saboon River is flooded, that those communities would experience flooding as well.
Yeah. Now, Tennille, let's be clear for our residents here. We've seen images of San Ignacio where people have water up to their rooftops. Are we going to see that type of flooding in Belize City, in Belize Rural?
I don't want to say that we will expect those levels because we have a lot of floodplains that the waters can fan out into.
Okay.
And so in those areas, it's rather hilly and the channels are sort of confined, that they don't have much space to fan out over the landscape. But it's a totally different story when it comes to the Belize River. A lot of the farmlands have been flooded already, and so that's absorbing some of the floodwaters coming down.
Okay.
That's based solely on the natural topography, correct?
Yes. Water will find the least part of resistance.
And so as we keep on monitoring this situation, I think we know that people have had to be evacuated so far. Some have had advanced warning that they should perhaps move from the river banks. The latest flood forecast, who are you targeting?
The flood forecast targets the entire country. It gives us a holistic picture so that everyone is informed of what is happening in their area. For areas of concern, you would notice that we put a flood warning or a flood watch or a flood alert within the flood forecast. So for now, the upstream communities have basically experienced their flooding, and now it's the downstream and middle reaches that need to look forward to receiving some flood waters.
The other point that you noted last week, and perhaps you can tell us if this situation has changed, that when the water comes into this area in Belize City, you said we're like a basin, and so it takes longer for it to go out into the sea. Is that still the case? The resident time of water on the landscape Marlene is also impacted by the force of the sea coming in. Okay.
So you would need to have a lot of velocity coming down the river, pushing out the sea. So I wouldn't say that it will run off within one day, but we do expect some resident time within the water because we also need to deal with the tides. And when the tides are high, you have that extra pressure. So that is the forces that one is both of them are pushing in opposite directions, and it's, who is the bigger beast in this case. So we always need to have that consideration within the back of our minds when it comes to resident floodwaters in any locality along the coast.
All right. Any advice for people who are watching this morning? Everyone is concerned about their own area. Where can they get the latest information from the hydrology unit?
We will be putting our flood forecast on our Facebook page, sorry. And we also disseminate it to the press and to other partners so that we get the information out. Maybe you might not go to our Facebook page, but it will be out via other avenues. And they could as well call into the office if they want to check on anything related to the flood forecast.
Okay. All right. So your best advice to people is that this is not over as yet.
Right, Marlene. It is not over as yet. We're seeing a lull. It is not over yet. Remain vigilant.
All right.
All right. Well, thank you very much for chatting with us this morning. We do appreciate it.
Sure, you're welcome, Marlene.
All right.
All right.
And there you had it. That was the principal hydrologist for the hydrology unit. Of course, they monitor the water flow of the riverways across the country. And I think the most important point was the one she closed with. The floods are not over as yet, and we must remain vigilant. Of course, the flood forecast will be released for today and provide for us a clear picture as to where the areas of higher risk are.
Certainly. So we have now the Chief Elections Officer, Josephine Tamai, who has joined us virtually as well. And as we promised, we're going into a discussion pertaining to the protocols, the measures that will be put into place as we go into elections on Wednesday. That being said, good morning, Ms. Tamai.
Hi, good morning.
Where do we begin from? Because a lot has happened over the past several days that one would say would perhaps affect what takes place on Wednesday. Perhaps let's begin by discussing what new measures, if any, will be implemented considering the flood situation in the West and what is pending for the Belize district and other parts of the country later this week.
Okay, in regards to that, as you rightly said, it is the flooding situation is something that we're monitoring very closely. We know that we are having challenges in terms of some of our polling stations, which quite possibly those might have to be relocated. Persons are able to get to their polling stations to vote this coming Wednesday. So that is something we're presently working on, and as the day progresses, things change as we go along. So we might have recommendation for changes at this time. In the next couple of hours, we have to look at making recommendations for other changes to be made if those are necessary at this point in time. Because as much as we're going into election, we want to ensure that we have the safety of the public officers and also safety of the voters in terms of those persons getting out to cast their votes.
Yeah. So I believe there are about 8 shelters open so far. Are any of these shelters scheduled to be polling stations?
Well, I have been communicating with NEMA over the weekend, and they have a list of those stations. So unless there is a need for them to use those stations as shelters, then they will be using them. In those cases, we will definitely need to relocate. We're looking at one right now in the west, where in Cala Creek, where there is no other option, but it seems as if though we might have to relocate that polling station. And like I said, we're also looking at those in the Belize district to see if there is a need, because we want to open polls, yes, but at the same time, we want to ensure that voters are able to reach those polling stations.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's something that we're monitoring, and I'll ask everybody to keep looking out to see what changes we'll be putting out as we proceed to Wednesday.
That's good to know that there's collaboration, so there's no overlap unless absolutely necessary.
Right.
Yeah.
Can you now perhaps reiterate for our viewers the measures that are in place for the Elections Day in respect of the COVID-19 situation. I know you've gone to great pains as the Elections and Boundaries Department to come up with these particular protocols in respect of voting. Kindly reiterate for us.
Okay, as we all know, managing elections in the context of COVID-19 has been a challenge for electoral management bodies. And we have looked at what other countries have done. We have collaborated and got advice from the Ministry of Health in terms of the protocols that we have in place. Stemming from what I said the last time, the voters will be able to go out on election day, which is this coming Wednesday. Polls open at 7 a.m. and closes at 6 p.m. Persons can go out to vote with or without without their voter identification card. We encourage persons, however, to take their voter identification card in order to speed up the process. We know that the protocols that we have in place will take a little bit longer than is the norm. So by presenting your identification card, the process will be much easier for us. When the voter goes to the polling station, we expect that everybody will follow the COVID-19 protocols. Face masks must be worn at all times. The 6 feet social distancing must be maintained. And also persons must expect to get sanitized at the polling stations prior to them entering inside of any polling station. So that is important for persons to understand, because we can put in all the safety measures in place, but if persons don't adhere, then that is where we can see problems coming in.
Yeah.
So when persons are in the line, I want to encourage those persons to please don't be speaking unnecessarily to your friends. We're in a pandemic. We're looking out for the safety, but at the same time, we want to ensure that persons are able to cast their vote, because if you don't come out to vote, then you will have to live with whatever the majority decides for you for the next 5 years. So, go ahead, Marlene.
No, I was going to ask you, it is going to be a holiday. How do you think that will impact the flow of voters for that day?
Well, I believe that it is something positive, because at the end of the day, persons will have more flexibility in terms of timing to come out and vote. We know that the law states that employers are to grant employees reasonable time off in order for them to get to the polls. In the past, we have had complaints whereby persons were saying that employers are not giving them the time off to come out and vote. So in these cases, yes, we know, even though it's a public and bank holiday, you do have some establishments that will still be open, but those persons are still entitled to reasonable time to go out and cast their vote. But at least with the holiday, persons can spread out depending on the time that they want to go. They don't have to be hurrying. You don't have these areas where you have peak periods, because people can come out however they choose between 7 and 6 p.m. I'll tell you, in some cases, and you all know that many times people are in lines from 5, 6 o'clock in the morning, even before the polls open.
Yeah.
So,
To try to get it in before work.
Right.
Yeah.
So we're hoping that with this holiday, people will be able to come out at different intervals to avoid the overcrowding.
I presume that there are quite a number of logistical considerations to be made as part of the preparations for Wednesday. At the various polling stations, do you know if, for instance, they have begun marking off the 6 feet distance on the ground and what have you, those kinds of preparatory works?
Right. In some cases, those have started, because I'll tell you, from last week, the returning officers and the presiding officers and poll clerks have already started to visit the polling stations to ensure that, one, they're adequate enough in terms of seeing how they're going to set up the polling stations. So those have happened in some areas. Late last week, because of the flooding and into the weekend, some of those were delayed, but the plan is to continue those as of today. And like I said, we also have to look at areas whereby the marking will be an issue because of the floods.
Yeah.
And the ground will be saturated in cases where it's ground, no?
Yeah.
So those are things that we're looking at. I will tell you that yes, it will be a challenge for us between now and Wednesday if we have to change polling stations, because as it presently stands, we're practically ready. We have everything in place, but if we are to change, then we have to look at splitting up the list in a different way to ensure that persons' names are on the list. If we're going to split villages or to open additional polling stations, we'll need to identify additional workers for those stations as well. So those are some of the logistical issues that we're looking at right now as we speak.
Well, I mean, if you look at some of the requirements for a polling station, and if we look at the situation in Belize City where you have the most polling stations, and we may be facing that flood, it's going to be a really critical kind of wait and see moment.
Right.
Yeah. So
Like
we'll expect perhaps an updated list or a final list end of tomorrow.
yes, we believe so.
Now let's talk about the changes that are in place for COVID, and I wanted to. Your ad is out. I think one of the things that's very clear in it, especially, is looking at things like priority access for the elderly, proper spacing and sanitization as we go along. I'm sure you know and you've heard that people are concerned about using pencils from elections and boundaries. Can people bring their own writing utensil to vote with?
Yes, that is something that the Commission has decided that they're going to allow persons to bring in their own pens, their pencils, if that would make them feel more comfortable. But I will tell you the measures that we have in place, it's basically safe because persons, like you rightly said, will be sanitized inside those polling stations. So it's safe for persons, but if persons believe that they want to bring their own for their own peace of mind, then we will allow for persons to do that as well.
Okay. And the campaign camps that are usually set out outside, we know that's a hotspot for congregation. Is that
Right.
going to be allowed?
Well, I noticed that the Commissioner of Police did send out something to the political parties informing them that they will be allowing 2 tents per party outside, but the number of persons who will be allowed to be under those tents will still remain at 10 at maximum, and persons must ensure that they adhere to the social distancing laws. If they don't, that is a matter for the police and they can be arrested if they don't follow those laws.
That's fair.
Now let's tackle the other big issue. I understand the Prime Minister has noted that COVID patients are not allowed to vote based on the quarantine regulations. If a quarantine positive person presents himself at a polling station, will your returning officer turn them away or disallow them from voting?
Well, what I'll say, Marlene, is if a person who is in quarantine breach any quarantine regulations, then that is a matter for the police. That person can be arrested and charged because they're breaking quarantine regulations.
That's right.
But we don't have a list of those persons who are in quarantine, so we won't know who those persons are. So like I said, that is something that the police will have to deal with.
So there is no protocol from the Elections and Boundaries Commission about disallowing quarantined persons from voting?
No, based on the protocols that we have in place, we're treating everybody, even ourselves, as though we're all COVID-19 positive. So if somebody should go to those stations and those persons are in quarantine, we would know, like I mentioned, and also the person will be allowed to cast their vote unless it is something that the police have dealt with prior to them reaching to the polling stations.
Okay. Rightful point. We don't know who would be COVID positive at this point.
Right, and the protocols are such that we have to ensure that we treat everybody in the same manner, because even though you might have persons in quarantine or persons who have tested positive, that is not to say those are the only persons who are positive.
Well, when you look at the fact that there's no longer a requirement for a list of names to be submitted to the Ministry of National Security, then clearly you won't have a list of persons who you can point to say, well, in any other circumstance, that individual would be eligible to vote. At this point, you don't have a list, so you have to treat everyone as if though they are in fact COVID positive.
Right. And like I said, even if you have a list, those are only the list of persons who have gone to get tested.
Yeah.
There are other persons who may not have tested, but that doesn't mean that they're not positive. So
They may not have been identified as yet.
Too many
Right.
variables.
Yeah. Let me, I mean, Ms. Tamai, I'm sure you're aware that people are very concerned about COVID. And we understand that even the public officers who are required to work have been expressing concerns. Some even trying to get an exemption of some sort. Tell me what is the situation here, and how does this affect the capacity to be able to effectively execute the elections?
I will tell you, it's no secret that it has been a challenge for us because we've been getting many letters from medical personnel saying that persons have underlying conditions, that they need to be exempted. So many different excuses. Some of them you'll find, I believe the doctors may have 2 or 3 templates that they would just stick in somebody's name, but it's not to say that the persons are being placed on sick leave or anything. Public officers, this is one of the duties that we take on when we agree to become a public officer. So public officers are required, and I'll tell you that we are ensuring the safety of public officers. At no point in time will we put any public officer's life in danger. I'll tell you, I myself is a public officer, and I wouldn't want for anybody to put me in danger as well. So we are providing the necessary PPEs for public officers. They're being provided with the KN95 mask for them to use. Additionally, face shields as well. They're given sanitizers, and I'm asking the public officers to please ensure that you take the necessary precautions. We're providing these items to you all, but at the same time, we expect that you're going to use them to ensure the safety of yourself and the safety of others. And like I said, it's not all, because we have many public officers as well who are volunteering and who are willing to work. And I must say thanks to those public officers. We all know that when it comes to election duties, public officers are the persons who carry out those duties. And I must say that they have done so and rise to the occasion in the past. And I'm certain that this time around, even though we're having challenges, the public officers will come through.
So there's not any shortage of public officers to be able to work the election, because I understand that some of the polling clerks will work right through to the counting phase as well, when there used to be a shift in schedule, right?
Right, and that has been something that we've shifted away from for a long period of time, because we find that it makes the process more effective and efficient when you have the same persons, because you are responsible for these ballots from the time they are issued. So when it comes to the reconciliation, the opening of the boxes, you know exactly from start up until finish. And when we have the simultaneous counting, it's not as if though persons count more than 500 ballots in their box. So we find that the process moves much faster and much more efficient when we utilize the same persons.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily because there is a shortage as such.
Okay.
But I'll tell you that yes, we have persons with medical certificates who are sending in medical certificates to us, persons who are claiming that they have underlying conditions. I will tell you that it's not every single letter that we get from a medical personnel that we could honor, because some of it is basically saying this person has certain conditions. And if we look across the public service, I'm certain we're going to find much more of these persons.
Yeah.
But again, we usually go for the willing, and those persons who refuse to perform election duties, those persons will be dealt with according to the public service regulation, because we know that the Belize Constitution, Section 88:12, it actually tells you that the commission, which is an independent body, that body has the authority to appoint public officers or any government authority in regards to executing its duties. And one of those duties of the commission is the conduct of elections. So no less than the commission has the authority to appoint those persons. And that is what is being done.
Okay.
One final question on my part. Mr. Mai. In terms of the counting process, how do you foresee that to go this time around, considering the fact that perhaps there will be an expansion of counting stations across the country?
Well, if you notice the list of counting stations, you will see whereby we have one counting station, maximum two, for each of the electoral divisions. Our boxes will be moved prior to the start of the counting. And so what we're going to do as well is to still have simultaneous counting. So let's say, for example, you have one of the counting stations, and for the most part, we're utilizing schools. The intent is for us to use the different classrooms within that school so that counting is happening simultaneously and avoiding so many persons being crowded in one room at the same time.
Yeah.
Okay. So with the curfew in place, there are going to be a lot less people moving around and observing. Is there going to be allowances for the observers to go into the room as when the counting is taking place?
Yes, there will be allowances for the observers to go in, but one of the things that we have asked the observers, because we have 421 polling stations across the country. So we are going to have 421 different rooms as well where counting will be happening. So what we're asking the observers is when they go in, if they see another observer in that specific room, to move along into another area and observe in a separate area, so as not to have them in one centralized location.
Okay. And I know you've been meeting with the political parties, so they sign off on this as well. They all agree to it together.
Right.
Okay. And what about international election observers? We know that CARICOM is sending a team. Anyone else coming?
Right. I know that COPAL has indicated interest. We're still waiting for some information from them. But from what I gathered, it seems likely that they are going to come in as well. And so in terms of international observers, that is the list that we have. But for local observers, we know that we have the Taiwanese embassy, the US embassy, we have the British embassy as well. So we have several groups. The numbers of persons in the observer groups vary. Some are very small, while others are a little bit larger. But like I said, we're asking them to just spread themselves out so as to avoid any overcrowding in the polling or counting stations.
So when you look at the counting process, it's not that different from the previous elections. We should be getting results. What's your estimated time?
Well, with this whole situation and the flooding and the road conditions now, it will vary across, because we know we have some polling stations that is basically 2 hours drive away from the counting station.
True.
So, and we don't know what the road condition will be like when the water recedes. So it will be a challenge for us. So I expect that the results may delay in some areas, but hopefully at least by 2 o'clock in the morning, I think we should have majority, if not all, of the results out.
And the Elections and Boundaries has used their website, I know, to update information throughout the course of the day. Tell us about some of the efforts you're making there with your team to keep the information disseminated to the public.
Okay, and I know that even this time around, because we want people to vote and basically go home, we know that the media will be critical in terms of assisting us in getting all the information, and even our website. So we still plan to have the hourly count, and I must stress that the hourly count is something that is unofficial. These are numbers that we get in on an hourly basis from our polling stations across the country. And some we know we have challenges in terms of telephone services. So there is a delay in terms of those figures coming into us. But as soon as we get information, we continuously will be updating in terms of the voter turnout throughout the day. Persons will be able to look at the information by constituency, overall for the entire country, by district, to see how the persons are turning up. So we expect to do that. And also we expect that once the results are out, we're going to be putting up those information on our website as well.
Okay. All right.
We also have what we call the voter lookup on our website. I want to encourage persons
Yes.
to utilize it to put in your information, your name, your date of birth, and to find exactly where your polling station is. I will tell you that if we're going to change some polling stations, we will experience some challenges in terms of the website, because from time to time we might have to take it down in order for us to upload the changes that we have. But some persons might say, but I'm not finding my information. You need to spell your name exactly how we have it on the document, because let's say, for example, you know that your name has an E instead of an I, and your official document had an I. That is how we will have it. So persons will say, but I don't find my information. But putting it in the way that the document actually has it is very critical. Otherwise, persons won't be able to find their names.
Yeah. And that voter lookup will be even more essential if there's a change in polling stations due to the floods.
Right, and we'll make public announcements in regards to those as well.
Okay. All right. Any final information you want to share with viewers? Of course, we want to get everyone to feel comfortable going to the polls come Wednesday.
Right, and I want to encourage persons to take this opportunity. In Belize, we have a right to vote. And even though we're in a pandemic, I want to encourage persons to come out and cast your vote. Because like I mentioned earlier, if you don't do that, then you are the ones who will allow other persons to make a decision for you. Mm-hmm. Yes, we don't know when the pandemic will be over. Yes, we have additional challenges in terms of the flooding, but just one day of sacrifice or a couple hours of sacrifice will make a difference for you as you go out and make your decision who you want to form the government of the day.
Thank you so much for sharing this latest update. We do appreciate it. And to you and your entire team, stay safe.
Thank you. And you guys stay safe as well.
All right. And with that, we're going to go ahead and take a final break. And when we come back, we'll have our wrap up. So stay tuned.